You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo first looked at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Writers have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, an award-winning filmmaker, self-professed book nerd, and creator of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. This podcast is for anyone who loves books, loves authors, loves France, or any combination therein. Each week, I'll speak with an author whose life, stories, or characters have a connection to France. Then, these amoureux de livres will treat us to a reading from their book. Welcome to the finale of the summer season of Storytime in Paris. In honor of this illustrious event, I will be speaking with New York Times bestselling author Christine Wells. Christine is known for her lavish historical fiction, and her latest novel, The Paris Gown, takes us to Paris in the 1950s. When best friends Claire, Gina, and Margot scatter to the far corners of the world and then find themselves back in Paris, it might just be a Christian Dior gown that reunites and helps heal them all. Hello, Christine. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Hi, Jennifer. It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
I am really excited to talk to you about the Paris gown. But before we dive into that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, as you might be able to tell, I'm Australian. I live in Brisbane, which is about an hour and a half's plane flight north of Sydney. So if you know anything about the geography of Australia, maybe you can picture where that is. And I've written quite a lot of books. I'm an historical fiction writer, and I've written about 16, 17 books now. Sometimes you lose count a bit. So, yeah, history is my passion. I've loved history ever since I was a child. And my dad used to tell me all about the kings and queens of England and, you know, all the nursery rhymes and all of the stories behind those nursery rhymes. And so I suppose historical fiction was just a natural fit for me when I came to write a novel. So that's what I've been doing for the past 23 years.
Wow.
And hopefully many more. They'll prize my cold, dead fingers from the keyboard.
Do you have a connection to Paris or to France?
Look, I don't have any formal connection, but I learnt French from fairly early age. My mother is a huge Francophile, so she used to have this book that she had at school, and it had all these pictures of a lion and so I learnt all of these French words when I was a young child, and I was lucky enough to go to a school where we learnt French in primary school, or what do you call primary school?
Elementary school.
Elementary, yes. So elementary school, and I learnt it right up till I was at the end of high schools. And we actually did a trip to France, a school trip to France, and that's when I fell in love. Like I loved it already, but being there is a whole different thing, and it was just, yeah. So I love writing about France and Paris and, yeah, all those lovely things. And Dior also is a real interest of mine, because I wrote about Catherine Dior in The Sisters of the Resistance. And so with the Paris gown, I'm revisiting my lovely Dior.
Have you had the opportunity to come to Paris or to France for research for your books?
Not in recent years, unfortunately. Various things have been going on apart from the pandemic in personal life, and I've got children. So, yes, very sadly, not in recent times, but I am hoping to get there next year. I gave the Olympic year a swerve, but both my children will be out of school next year. So that is my year for travel, and I really look forward to going back.
Fabulous. Did you have the opportunity to wear a Dior gown as part of your research?
I really wish I could. I asked my accountant if I could get anything off my tax, but unfortunately, no. And unfortunately, the advance of a writer does not extend to Dior gowns, but one can dream, and that's why I write, so I can live through my characters vicariously.
Well, speaking of all of that, can you tell us a little bit about the Paris gown? What is your book about?
Well, I call it my book about fashion and friendship, and it really is a loving tribute to female friendship and how it gets us through thick and through thin over the years. And as you grow older, I will be turning 50 this year. I just more and more, my female friendships are just increasingly important to me. And I see that with my mother as well. I mean, she went to a school reunion on the weekend and there were 12 people from her year group. And they have it every year now because there are fewer and fewer of them. So the Paris gown is about three friends who met when they were all at a cordon bleu cooking course. And one of them is a serious chef. Her name's Claire, and she's Parisienne. But the other two, one is from Australia, as am I, and one is from America. So those two foreigners came to Paris to be finished. They did all of the things that young ladies do, and one of which in those days was to go to a cookery course at Le Cordon Bleu. And it was really interesting reading Julia Child's memoir about her time there and how she learnt French cooking at the Cordon Bleu school. So that's where they met, and they're quite young when the story opens. And then they each go their separate ways and life happens, and then they all come together again in Paris some years later, and the story goes from there. But the gown itself is a Dior couture ball gown that they get to share between them. And it's a very special gown, and it has great significance for each of them in their personal journeys.
Beautiful. We should also say that this takes place in the 1950s in Paris, in case that wasn't explicit.
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you.
Yes.
I should have said that.
No, I realized that you were giving such a beautiful description, but just to anchor us exactly in time.
Yes, yes. So it is the heyday of Dior when Christian Dior was still alive and designing his beautiful gowns. And he is a character in this book as well.
I wanted to ask you about that because I know that you've written about his sister, Catherine, before and her fascinating story. Was it more challenging to write about Christian, to write about someone who is more well known to the public?
I think it was actually more challenging to write about Catherine because there was so little known about her, whereas I think with Christian, I didn't worry too much about him, partly because no one ever seems to have a bad word to say about him. And, so that makes it so much easier to make him a lovely character in the book. And you don't have to worry that you're glossing over any bad characteristics he might have. And he had a memoir as well, which was beautifully translated into English, just really a lyrical sort of memoir about how the fashion house started and how he creates. And so getting his voice through that, I don't know, I found that much easier than some of the other real people I've written about.
Interesting. Yeah, he seems in the book, and I guess in life, he just seems lovely.
Yeah.
Like a warm person.
I think he was very caring towards his staff and towards his models, and it just seems like that's the kind of person he was. So, yeah, he was really lovely to write.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the research that you did around him and if there was anything that particularly surprised you about him that you uncovered.
Yes, well, one thing that is surprising was his superstition and his superstitiousness. He used to visit a clairvoyant called Madame de la Haye. And he really set a huge store by what she told him. And she guided a lot of his choices, really big choices throughout his career. I think there was early in his life, somebody told him that he was going to make a huge success of life and it would involve women. And he did a few things throughout his life. He didn't start out as a fashion designer. He owned an art gallery with avant-garde art, and he did quite a few different things. His father was a manufacturer of fertilizer. And so that was sort of, the family business was almost in dire opposition to the persona of Dior. And of course, he was conscripted into the workforce for the Nazis when they occupied France. He was sent to a farm to work, and he actually quite enjoyed that. Surprisingly enough. And then he became a sketch artist. He would sketch dresses and write about them. And then, things evolved into becoming a designer. But he had an interesting beginning as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I know these women, so you have three different women from three different cultures, but I was reading that they were also inspired by some real life women. Can you tell us a little bit about the women that inspired them?
Yes, well, the main one who was heavily inspired by an Australian woman called Robin Dalton was Margot. Robin was a really interesting character. She grew up in Australia, in Sydney and in King's Cross, which you probably wouldn't know, but it is where the underbelly of Australian crime lived, and just the seedy side of life. So they'd have strip clubs and nightclubs and all sorts of things going on in King's Cross. And she lived in this big house on the edge of King's Cross, and they were quite a wealthy family, but her father was a physician and he was a doctor to all kinds of people, including criminals, and he used to keep a loaded gun in his surgery desk. So she grew up in quite an eccentric household, and it's such a character, and reminded me a lot of Nancy Mitford, that kind of family where everybody was just a little bit off centre and, quite unexpected for that era, because she actually got married and suffered from domestic abuse. And then she ran away to London as she divorced and went to London and met a whole host of fascinating people, and one of whom was David Mountbatten. David Mountbatten, who was cousin to Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. And so she led this amazing life. She went on to spy for the King of Thailand and later became a literary agent and film producer. And she had this host of famous clients like Jackie Collins, or Joan Collins or Jackie Collins, one of the Collinses, Laurence Olivier and Peter Carey, who's a very famous Australian writer, and she produced a film of one of his books called Oscar and Lucinda. So she was just such a fascinating character, and Margot is loosely based on her. It's not her. There are significant differences, but she was my guiding light when I was writing Margot. And Gina is not really based on anyone in particular. I looked at certain novelists of the time and journalists, and she's a bit of an amalgam of a few of those. But she's a journalist aspiring to be a novelist at the time that we come back into the book. And then Claire is based on, she's not really based on anybody, but I did a lot of research into a French chef who was the first female to receive a Michelin star. And actually, she was the first person to receive 3 Michelin stars for her restaurants. And I'm afraid her name is escaping me at the moment. I think it was Brossard. Anyway, she was quite a legend in the French cookery, and she was the mentor of a lot of famous French chefs as well. So Claire, I did the research on Claire based on her.
Fascinating. That's very interesting. I feel like maybe the Robin person deserves her own book as well now.
Well, I thought that. I thought maybe I should have written a whole book about Margot. And then I thought, but Robin Dalton already has her memoirs, and I don't think you can improve on those. So I just fell in love with her as a person. And, you know, she only passed away a couple of years ago. She was actually interviewed when the Duke of Edinburgh died about her long-standing friendship with him. So I had a look at that on YouTube, and you can see the lady herself.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? Don't Miss This takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Every Monday, you'll get 20 to 35 new Parisian events with descriptions, links, and all the details sent directly to your inbox. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Sign up for Don't Miss This on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So when you're writing these three different women from three different cultures, three different backgrounds, three different ways of life, how did you write them? And I mean, like literally, how did you write them? Did you write one at a time? Did you switch back and forth? Did you have different rituals for each person? How did you manage that?
Well, when I write, I feel a little bit like I'm an actor taking on a role. So I don't think, it's funny. It's like when they talk, it's just them, and it's quite a natural process, and I don't need to write one all at the same time. And I felt that each of them, they don't have separate stories. Each of them has a pivotal role to play in the other's story, and it's the story of the three of them together as well. And so I don't know if it would have worked to write them separately, I think. And the way they play off each other, for some reason, I have been part of about two or three-person friendships. And so you sort of realize that you get different things from different people. For example, Margot loves books and she becomes a literary agent. Gina is writing novels. Claire doesn't read, but Claire has a great work ethic that she also sort of spurs Gina on to say, yes, of course you can do this. You just have to be disciplined. You have to do it. You have to write every day. This is what I'm telling myself while I'm writing the book, you know. And then Claire is the peacemaker. Margot and Gina sometimes sparks fly because they're two quite strong personalities. So Claire is there, the glue that keeps everybody together. But then she has her own issues that the others help her with. So it just felt, I really enjoyed writing that book. It's not as historical event heavy as my other books. I really just loved working on that relationship between the women and the way women help each other, and they hold each other's feet to the fire sometimes and say, you know, you're not living up to your potential, or this isn't you. We're seeing this side of you, but we know what you're like underneath. So that was really what the book was about for me, was just exploring that friendship.
Yeah, that was definitely my favorite part of the book too. And I feel like as you're describing it now, and when I look back at reading the book, it feels like a braid, like they're sort of woven together in these ways that are inextricable and together make something really beautiful.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
You said, you alluded to this before, that the book you thought was maybe going to go in one direction and ended up being more maybe about Dior himself and the gown, and it ended up becoming more about the friendships that you just mentioned there. Was there a moment when you were writing when you thought, like, oh, that's what this book is?
Yes, I think probably in revisions. I did have a lot more plot in it at the start, and then I thought, no, this is the book about their friendship, and one of their stories ended a little bit differently, and then I just decided, no, this is how it has to end for that character. That is what needs to happen. And so it just all fell into place. But you come up with a concept for a book and you say, oh, I'm going to write a book about three women who share a gown. And then you think, well, hang on, how do they share it? Because these gowns are custom made, they have to be fitted to the person's body. So that was a bit of a constraint that then helped structure the book, because they don't swap it around all the time. Each of them wears it once in the book. And I think that sometimes constraints can really help, because then oh, okay, so that's what has to happen, and that gives you structure.
That makes sense. The place that you have, most of the book is set in Claire's family's brasserie and the apartment just above it. Was that a real place that you had been to, or is that from your imagination? It's so clear in my mind, so I'm just wondering whether it was a real place.
There is a place that I was thinking of when I wrote it that I've been to in Paris. And it just the stained glass and that warm feeling, and just the smells and the banquettes and all of that atmosphere. I tried to really convey that. Don't know about the apartment upstairs. That's something that I just imagined. But I thought, well let's have an apartment building that has a common hallway with this restaurant, so we can come and go like that. So yeah, that was just in my imagination. But that was informed by all those beautiful Parisian apartments, which unfortunately I have never stayed in myself, but I've seen where, it's just that French provincial style of decor and the floating curtains and the pale green walls and all of that kind of thing. That's just what I was thinking of with that apartment.
Yeah, it's very, very easy to picture as you describe it. So each of these three women has sort of their own field of expertise, at least in the beginning. We have a world of cuisine, we have the world of fashion, and we have the world of literature or journalism. I imagine that you are most familiar with the world of literature. Is that true? And how familiar were you with the other two worlds before you began?
Yes, that is true. And I was thinking as I was writing it, I wonder if my agent will read, because she reads all my books. I wonder if she'll take offense at this, or, because I think I made being a literary agent sound quite easy. But anyway, she didn't make any comment about that part of it. It was what I think goes on anyway. Obviously, writing, there's always a lot of me in a novelist, or I wrote about a jewelry maker in the Royal Windsor Secret, and I wrote about how she thinks of her creativity, and that taps into my ideas. Cuisine, my mother is a very good cook, and I always used to help her in the kitchen. So she would do extremely fancy dinner parties for her friends, and I'd get the little leftovers or whatever afterwards. But unfortunately, I cannot claim to be that proficient, but I did do some research on that one. And I actually bought the French chef's who I mention in the book, Madame Brasier. So I have her cookbook, and my idea is maybe I'll cook some things on the internet, but it'll be one of those disaster films probably.
Those go viral. There's nothing wrong with that. So I have a bonus question for you. You've written, you said 16 or 17 works of historical fiction. Of all of the time periods you've written about, which is the one that you would most like to live in?
The one I'd most like to live in. Oh, it's such a hard question, because women have been so oppressed.
This is true.
Yeah, it depends what station of life. But I think I have written about the 18th century, and I would be really fascinated to go back and visit, not live. I probably think I would want to live in the most recent period I've written about, which is the 1950s. So let's go with that. But I think I'd have to be a bit of an iconoclast. I think I'd have to be a rebel because I don't think I could do the 1950s housewife thing.
Yeah, you make excellent points.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true, because it's not like you're writing characters who are just blending in with the time that they're in and just so happy to be at their own station.
Yeah, I mean, do we want to read about that sort of person? I think we want to see women striking out and being individuals and not conforming necessarily.
I agree. That's what I want to read anyway. If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy my other podcast, City of Muses. Each week, I chat with contemporary artists and creatives to explore what inspires them, what their creative processes are like, where their ideas come from, and more. Think of it as Storytime in Paris's little sister. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. Speaking of which, this might be the perfect time for us to hear a little bit from the book, from the Paris Gown. Is there anything that we need to know contextually before you read for us?
Just that this is the prologue. So this is the very start of the book, and our three friends are together, but they're just about to part ways, and they're window shopping in front of the House of Dior.
The Paris Gown by Christine Wells. Prologue. Claire. Paris, France, 1950. Three young women stood arm in arm on the Avenue Montaigne, breaths clouding together in the crisp air, shining faces lifted toward a display window at the House of Dior. That one! Claire flung up her free arm as if she were on a stage, introducing the star of the show. That is the one! Gina, a cool, tanned blonde, lifted one eyebrow. Dark, lively Margot nodded vehemently. Oh, yes, most definitely, you must have this one. Window shopping, just as the twilight hour settled like a soft veil over Paris, was a habit the three friends had turned into an art. They met once a week to stroll the fashionable boulevards and feast their eyes on the sumptuous creations displayed in the atelier windows. But for Claire, visits to those other couturiers were mere flirtations. No one compared to Dior. Only look at the embroidery, she breathed, gazing up at this latest creation on display. And the sequins, there must be thousands of them. The gown's train was made of cascading scalloped layers, dotted with sequins, and feathered at the edge with the iridescent, pale pink paillettes, designed to shiver and shimmer as one moved. The bodice was strapless, and the whole effect suggested a goddess emerging naked from the sea at dawn. How long must it take to sew a creation like that? Some girls change lovers with the seasons, said Margot with a twinkle in her eye. Claire has passionate relationships with dresses. At least she's monogamous, Gina pointed out. Comment? Though Parisian to the core, Claire had fallen into the habit of speaking English when she was with her friends. Claire's mother had been an Englishwoman. She had passed on her language to Claire, along with her red hair and her fiery temper, but still there were some words that Claire did not understand. One gown at a time, explained Gina, and one couturier, always Dior. Claire sighed and shook her head. I could never afford it. How many times had she said this now? Margot gave her hand a sympathetic squeeze. Claire, an apprentice chef from a middle-class family, was no more likely to purchase this gown than she was the many other creations they'd sighed over together on their outings during the past 2 years. Gina's Connecticut ancestors had sailed on the Mayflower, and Margot's family wealth derived from the Australian wool trade. Their closets were full of couture dresses, which they insisted Claire borrow when they'd taken her out to society events with them. But she'd never had a stitch of clothing from Dior to call her own. The three young women had met at Le Cordon Bleu cookery school, from which they had since graduated, though goodness knew how Gina and Margot had managed it. Gina didn't care about food or cooking. She spent each lesson lost in thought about the novel she was writing, so her soufflés fell and her sauces split. Margot had been as mercurial in the kitchen as in everything else. Revolted by the prospect of spatchcocking a chicken or gutting a fish, she was a maestro with pastry and chocolate, and had even managed to win praise from their exacting instructor, Monsieur Guillaume. Only Claire was serious about the culinary arts. She'd practically grown up in the family brasserie after all. Unlike Margot and Gina, Claire had soon developed ambitions well beyond a cookery course that was expressly designed to prepare rich young ladies for marriage. After finishing the introductory course, she'd barged into the professional chef's class and refused to take no for an answer. Eventually, her persistence had been rewarded. Claire had become the lone female student amid rows of arrogant, dismissive men. But now that their finishing was complete, Margot and Gina were returning home. This was the last time the three of them would gather together in front of La Maison Dior.
Wonderful. So what is next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
I do. My next book is tentatively titled The Lost Perfumes of Paris.
Ooh.
And I can't say too much more about it, but hopefully it'll be out late next year.
It sounds like we might have another excuse to speak in the future then.
Very much so. That would be lovely. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing? And this book is coming out very shortly. I think this episode will come out about a week before the book actually comes out. So where can people find you? How can they keep up to date with everything that's going on in your world?
The best place is my newsletter list. So you can join that on my website, which is christine-wells.com. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. So just search my name there. You'll find me.
And I'll put links and everything in the show notes so people can find you directly through this episode as well.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. It was so lovely speaking with you. Thank you for taking the time all the way from Australia.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you again to Christine Wells for being such an excellent season finale guest. You can find Christine on Instagram at ChristineWells_, on Twitter at ChristineWells0, on Facebook at Christine Wells Author, and on her website, christine-wells.com. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.